Welcome back from break. My name is John Anzer. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs here at the Chamber. It's great to see everyone this morning and to welcome you to our breakout session on air issues, which will take a focus on greenhouse gas emissions. I'm really excited to introduce our two experts today from Trinity Consultants, which is a leading global environmental consulting firm, who are here to provide an update on air issues. So with us today is Wendy Mers. Wendy is Director of Sustainability Services at Trinity Consultants and a principal consultant. For nearly 25 years, Wendy has supported clients across industries with environmental regulatory compliance, air quality permitting, and sustainability initiatives. In her current role, Wendy coordinates Trinity's service offerings in environmental sustainability, helping industrial clients meet demands related to a low-carbon economy. She also manages Trinity's strategic technical support to several industry groups, including the Global Steel Climate Council and One Future. Also joining us today is Christy Heath with Trinity Consultants. She is the office manager for Trinity's Philadelphia office, and she has more than 20 years of environmental consulting and project management experience. Christy assists clients with a variety of environmental compliance issues across industries like refining, petroleum bulk terminals, paper manufacturing, oil and gas, aerospace, and general manufacturing. In addition, Christy serves as an instructor for courses on tank regulations, state regulations, and environmental reporting. She's also a member of DEP's Air Quality Technical Advisory Committee. So with that, I will welcome to the podium Wendy and Christy. Thank you.
Thanks, John. All right, so appreciate the intro, and we'll go ahead and get started. Since our session is before lunch, we'll just keep the wheels moving here. Just a intro slide on Wendy and I, and we'll get right into the presentation. So today we're talking about air issues, but really a focus on greenhouse gas emissions and sustainability, and we're going to discuss the topic between two lenses, right? One is going to be the regulatory lens, kind of the command and control structure that a lot of us environmental professionals are used to from EPA and the PADEP. And then the second is kind of the voluntary structure that follows through on the sustainability and the greenhouse gas emissions issues. All right, so I just have a couple of quick intro slides on Trinity. Trinity, we're an environmental consulting company. Really have grown up in the air quality consulting realm. We've been around for 50 years now, so almost the whole way back to when the Clean Air Act was initially enacted. So our air quality expertise is really going to play into our discussion today about greenhouse gas emissions. I'd just like to put up our slide of our office locations, offices in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. And I like to say the local everywhere is super important for environmental consulting because we're dealing with national programs, but also implementation on the local level. So those relationships with regulators are super important. And as I mentioned, today we're going to be focusing in on sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions topics. And so our technical expertise comes from, our engineering background and the fact that as air quality kind of geeks, I'll be honest, we've been following these issues for years. So we're really focused on helping clients, with the technology, the technical basis of their greenhouse gas emissions portfolio and their sustainability portfolio. Like, what are your emissions? And then helping our clients develop those sustainability strategies. All right, so in terms of today's talk, we're going to focus on, as I mentioned, two lenses to talk about greenhouse gases and the updates that we're seeing in the workplace here. First is on the regulatory side. So what is EPA or state agencies? And I'll give it the Pennsylvania lens for our discussion today. And then I'm going to pass it over to Wendy, and she's going to talk about the climate disclosure drivers from the corporate level, the product level, and the project level. And then certainly we'll definitely take any questions at the end. All right. So on the regulatory drivers side, this discussion really, I'll say, dovetails really well with what we all heard this morning. So in our two talks this morning, I heard discussions on the natural gas industry in the state, right? And then the power industry in the state. And so what we'll be talking about in terms of greenhouse gas regulatory developments are also very much focused on those two industries, right? The power industry, the oil and gas industry, and then I've got a little bit on refrigerants at the end of this discussion. All right, so just wanted to start by setting the stage for the discussion. EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, but there are only certain provisions that they've utilized or really developed for greenhouse gas regulations. So today we'll be primarily talking about Clean Air Act Section 111B and 111D. But there are other parts of the Clean Air Act that also can regulate greenhouse gases. So specifically, BACT under PSD projects, and then the I'll say the light blue highlighted bullets are levers that EPA has not really pulled in terms of greenhouse gas regulation, but there's certainly things that could come up in the future. So yeah, we'll be talking about 111B, NSPS, New Source Performance Standard rules, and then 111D, which is emission guideline requirements. Okay, so on the power industry side, and we'll see this kind of echoed on the oil and gas side as well. EPA we all know it's an election year in Pennsylvania, right? So the Biden administration is very busily, working through their priorities on the regulatory agenda side. And so it's been a very busy year for final rules from EPA. So on the power plant, EPA finalized the greenhouse gas power plant rule this last May. So this is a final rule that's effective, applies to fossil fuel power generating sources. And A lot of these rules are under litigation, right, as soon as they're finalized. And so just last week, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to stay this regulation. There are other legal challenges working through the courts, but it is currently in effect. So this rule regulates under two prongs. The first is the traditional, from an air quality standpoint, process of regulating through new source performance standards. So that's the 111B of Clean Air Act. And that section of this suite of rules regulates greenhouse gas emissions from stationary combustion turbines. And because it's new source performance standards, this applies to new and reconstructed gas turbines. And we'll talk about the specific requirements in the next slide. So new and reconstructed sources, greenhouse gas standards for combustion turbines. And then on the existing source side, EPA has published emissions guidelines. So the regulatory structure for the emission guidelines is that EPA gives a guideline, which is basically like a model rule. And then each state needs to approve the model rule or the guideline, or give their own plan back to EPA. And so the timing on this is a little bit different. So again, that's focused on existing sources. In this case, the existing sources are steam generating units, steam generating power units, so like boilers. And it's regulating coal-fired and natural gas-fired units and oil units. So because the 111D rule requirements are that the states need to submit a plan. The states get 2 years to submit that plan. So the initial state plans are due to EPA by May of 2026. And as part of that plan, each state must designate the sources, the initial categorization of the units in the state. After that, EPA has 12 months to review that plan, so we're talking 2027, assuming that EPA finalizes and approves the plan. The compliance dates will be after that, and in this particular rule, the compliance dates are discussed in the rule. So I wanted to give this like kind of one screenshot of what EPA finalized in this power plant greenhouse gas rule. And this chart is actually from EPA's website, but it's a great, got everything on one page kind of summary. So as I mentioned, EPA is for new or reconstructed turbines are on these two columns. And basically, EPA has finalized greenhouse gas emission standards that units need to meet based on how their capacity factor, so how often they're running. And at least in the first phase, it's mostly based on making sure that the units are operating efficiently. And then EPA also has a second phase on the turbine side that's going to pull in starting in 2032. And in that case, they've identified for base load units some significant reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. And they've basically assumed that carbon capture is going to be available in the market at that time. though they've also noted that sources may be able to comply with those standards by using like hydrogen co-firing or hydrogen firing. So again, looking at significant reductions on the gas turbine side. And again, these only apply to new or reconstructed units, as of like 2023. So that's what's happening on the gas turbine side. Also interesting per our discussion this morning is what's happening to these existing boilers, right? Existing steam generating units. And EPA has standards for coal-fired boilers and natural gas and oil-fired boilers. Coal-fired boilers, basically, if you're going to be operating a coal-fired boiler after 2039, that coal-fired boiler will need to have carbon capture control. So these are pretty aggressive, I'll say, standards with the technology that we've currently seen implemented in the industry. And then on the natural gas and oil fired boilers side, the standards are more related, again, to combustion efficiency of the units. And there's various tiers for each. So while I'm still talking about the power industry, I wanted to give an update on RGGI, and again, that was also discussed this morning. RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that Pennsylvania, I'll say, tried to sign on to a couple of years ago, and it's been working its way through the courts, has been stayed. And last year, about this time, the Commonwealth Court found that the original RGGI executive order was unconstitutional because it basically was a tax on the industry in that it was bringing in way more funds and not using than the program needed to run. And those funds were just going to go to the PADP. Governor Shapiro has appealed this ruling to the PA State Supreme Court. And so they're waiting for a final decision from the courts on Pennsylvania's participation in RGGI. In addition to that, the governor has proposed two alternative, I'll say, climate initiatives. Since RGGI's been on hold. The first is the PA Climate Emission Reduction Program, PACER. And this is basically, as was noted in this morning's discussion, RGGI is a region-wide carbon cap and trade program. This would be a state-wide carbon cap and trade program, so just for Pennsylvania. The second program that's been, I'll say, proposed is the PA Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard, or what they're calling PRESS. This is an update to the state's renewable energy portfolio. So we talked about that this morning, that Pennsylvania's current renewable energy portfolio is calling for like an 8% tier 1 renewable energies. And this proposal takes Pennsylvania to 35% renewable energy by 2035. So both of those, I'll say, programs require legislative action. My understanding is that they're not moving forward in the current legislature. But they're both still out there. And I think probably waiting for some final decision on RGGI. All right, so moving on from the power industry side to oil and gas. And we'll see some similarities here in terms of how EPA has structured the rules. So on the oil and gas side, EPA has finalized NSPS Quad O-B this year and Quad O-C, using those same portions of the Clean Air Act, 111B and 111D. So NSPS Quad O-B is like a standard, like I said, for air technical geeks, new source performance standard. It applies to oil and gas sources that were new or reconstructed after December of 2022, and is requiring additional controls. They've enacted new programs called the Super Emitter Program, additional LDAR requirements. All of this is regulating VOC emissions and methane. And then under Quad O-C, this is again an emissions guideline, so that's applying to existing sources. But again, we have the same timeline that we're talking about for on the power side. That the state plans have to be proposed and then finalized. So I did want to just spend a quick minute on Pennsylvania's Quad O-C program. So Pennsylvania's initial plan on Quad O-C is to basically just incorporate the federal, what I'll call the model rule, by reference. And one of the, I think the reasons that they gave for that is just the timing. Pennsylvania's rulemaking process takes, in their own estimate, more than 2 years, and they only get 2 years to do this because this is due now by March 2026. So they're already a year and a half, or they're already half a year in. And then again, EPA has 12 months to review and approve. Then there's another 2 years before this Quad O-C will be effective for the regulated community. All right, so I just wanted to give, going in a slightly different direction, but focused on the oil and gas industry, just wanted to give a quick update on the methane waste emissions charge, or WEC. This is a proposed rule. It has not been finalized. It was proposed earlier this year. And it's basically a methane charge or a methane fee for the oil and gas industry. It's based on actual emissions each year, but they've proposed a $900 per ton fee on excess methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. Again, not finalized yet, but they had originally said, hey, this is going to be effective for, I guess the first fees were supposed to be paid in 2020, early 2025. So we'll wait and see on that one. But certainly in that industry, again, another driver to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is, having obviously to pay fees on those. EPA, another initiative I would say that EPA has been working on in the greenhouse gas space recently is just the gathering of data from industrial sources, right? You can't regulate it if you don't know what it is, but it's a lot easier to regulate it if you've been able to quantify it. So they've been finalizing a lot of greenhouse gas reporting changes under Part 98 in this last year. First of all, in April of this year, they finalized updates to the global warming potentials that are published in the rules that facilities have to use when they're reporting their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's something to be aware of, especially, and those changes were effective as of January 1 of 2024. So when you do your greenhouse gas reports in March of 2025, you should be using those updated numbers. And they've also expanded the number of source categories that have to report and change calculation methodologies and things of that nature. They had another rulemaking in May of this year that was finalized, which updated requirements under subparts A, which is their general requirement, general section, subpart C, which is combustion, and then most significantly subpart W, which is oil and gas. So adding, again, new sources that needed to be included in those emissions reports. All right. And I'll close the regulatory update section with just a quick note on refrigerants. This is another area the EPA has been regulating under greenhouse gases because refrigerants that were used, I'll say in the 90s, we determined a lot of refrigerants were ozone depleting substances. The replacements for those refrigerants were HFCs, which happen to also be very powerful greenhouse gases. And so EPA has finalized a rule that's really focused on HFC management. There's two things I want to point out about this rule. One is that they've reduced for HFCs the threshold that you need to complete leak repair requirements on your refrigeration system to 15-pound units. That's like a 15-pound circuit. The ozone depleting substances rules have that threshold at 50 pounds, right? So going down from 50 to have to track your leaks to 15 is a significant reduction. They're also requiring automatic leak detection systems on refrigerant systems that have over 1,500 pounds in the circuit. So again, really large systems. So again, refrigerants, they're pretty ubiquitous, so it's important to keep track of these updates. So I will turn it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Christy. So I'm going to change the lens here a little bit. So we've talked about what's driving GHG quantification and reduction at the facility level under Clean Air Act regulations. And quite frankly, that's not been moving really quickly. There's a lot of litigation that's involved in a number of those regulations. And so what I'm involved in as far as helping companies with their sustainability programs involves other drivers beyond regulatory. And we're seeing that they're really having a pretty substantial effect on what companies need to quantify, understand with respect to their footprint and what they may need to disclose, and then maybe also seek to reduce and mitigate. And so those drivers, starting from, there are regulations that are impacting a broader range of greenhouse gas disclosure. But there's also been a number of incentives with the Biden administration in particular that is driving the market to quantify, disclose their greenhouse gases and reduce their emissions. Also, investors are very interested in this information because they want to understand if a company is going to remain viable in a low carbon economy. And so that is a big consideration. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then supply chain pressure to reduce emissions, mostly by companies that have made pretty aggressive goals with respect to their climate commitments. And then finally, your own company may be one of those companies that has a very mature climate strategy, have made commitments to reduce their footprint. And so you need to be having a very good understanding of your greenhouse gas emissions. And so before I talk about that, I have this divided into 3 different categories of GHG disclosure. The first one, which you might be most familiar with, is corporate accounting. So this is the disclosure of your emissions at the corporate level, which includes all of your direct as well as indirect emissions from your operations. So, and when we talk about this, you talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and that has been outlined and been in place for many, many years due to the GHG protocol, which is a global standard for quantifying your emissions. And so scope 1 emissions are from your direct operations, and it's very similar to, facility emissions that you're reporting. Scope 2 are the emissions that are generated from the electricity that you purchase or the steam that you purchase. So you're not emitting it directly, but because of your use of that electricity, there are emissions that are occurring at the generation site that you need to account for as scope 2. And then when we talk about scope 3, that's looking at your entire value chain, upstream and downstream. What is the impact of your operations along those, both upstream and downstream? So upstream, we're talking all the way from extraction and production of maybe the fuel that you're using or the raw materials that you're using, the transport to your site, and then downstream, your transport of your product to your customers, as well as there's 15 different categories. So just, it's a lot to quantify, and companies have been very reluctant to go there because you don't have control of that data. It's very difficult to get that information, but it's becoming more and more of a hot topic and a requirement. And we'll talk about that, why that is. Product accounting, that's looking at the emissions associated with a given product. A lot of times we talk about embodied carbon. That's looking at the amount of emissions that are greenhouse gases that were emitted in producing that product, and it's given on on the basis of a functional unit. So per ton of steel produced, per ton of lime produced. So we're putting that in terms of the product that's being made, and that's really being we're seeing a lot of requests there due to supply chain requests, drivers. So that's for companies that want to know what their emissions are for their upstream. They're asking companies, what is the embodied carbon of what I'm buying from you? And then finally, project accounting. The idea there is looking, and you hear about carbon offsets. So how do they quantify a carbon offset? They look at that project and say, okay, this project, if we do it, it's going to avoid emissions someplace else, and we need to quantify that. So when you're talking about project emissions, you quantify the emissions from the project and you compare it to some kind of baseline. And so we're seeing this in the work we do with a lot of industry clients, with industries that are taking advantage of the tax credits, tax incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as some of the DOE funding opportunities, because those opportunities have thresholds with respect to how much the emissions need to be reduced, and you need to prove that through this project accounting. So I'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so looking, and I don't know if you noticed, but we have these little icons. So I'm going to talk, the icon right now with the industry symbol is the corporate disclosure. And so there was a lot of talk over the last couple of years about an SEC regulation that's really being driven by the investment community, that desire for investors to know, if they should invest in a company, how viable they're going to be in a low carbon economy. Well, that was proposed back in 2022. That proposed rule had 24,000 comments, so it took a while to get it actually finalized. Again, happened this year, and right away it was stayed and is currently stayed pending judicial review. But one thing to know is if you're a large company that and this is for publicly traded companies, if you're a company that may be subject to that rule, if that stay, if the court rules in favor of SEC and that stay is lifted, the compliance deadlines aren't going to change. So we're seeing a lot of folks really starting to take this seriously as far as having to report those emissions. And so what does that entail? So one aspect of this climate disclosure has to do not actually with the quantity of emissions, but looking at the risks involved with climate change. And its actual and potential material impacts of your business strategy going forward. What's going to happen to your company as the economy decarbonizes, and looking at the energy sector, that's a big question. And hearing all of the complexity as far as understanding what that looks like that we talked about this morning, that can be very difficult to forecast, but that's what's being asked by the investment community. And then the SEC rule is looking for disclosure of just scope 1 and scope 2. The proposed rule had also included scope 3, and that had a lot of other companies that aren't publicly traded a little bit in a panic, because if these companies are asking for scope 3, that means they're going to be asking their supply chain for that information. And then also information about targets and goals. This whole quantifying GHGs is one thing, but then that is the basis for setting reductions. So also wanted to know about if there are targets and what they're based on, if they're technically sound. So that's the status of SEC. On the global front, there's a regulation at the EU. EU is kind of like California. They're always leading the way on a lot of these sustainability type initiatives. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, went into effect last year. And this also impacts publicly traded companies that are located in the EU, but also companies from third countries like the US that may have major operations in the EU are also subject to this rule. And so this isn't only GHG focused, it is a whole array of environmental and social issues that need to be reported on. The EU is coming up with their own standards for these reports. And it also has this requirement for double materiality. When we talk about reporting under sustainability, this idea of materiality is very important. And that's really determining which issues are material to your operations. And when we talk about reporting greenhouse gases on scope 3, we talk about which categories are material to your operations. And it's really looking where you have the most impact, usually looking from the inside out. How much impact does your company have on those environmental impacts, on water, or on greenhouse gases? This idea of double materiality is also looking from the outside in under this regulation, meaning that you need to look at what the financial impact is to your company because of these social initiatives or environmental initiatives that may impact your operations. So, what is the financial impact to your company if there is a low carbon economy is part of it. So you're looking at the financial impacts as well as the environmental impacts with this double materiality idea under this regulation. How might this impact you? This is a regulation where they are looking for scope 3. So if you are a company that provides a product to a large corporation, they could be coming to you for your footprint or your embodied carbon of the product that you're selling them, because they need to report that. California also has their own version of this type of rule. So in 2023, Governor Newsom signed into law this package. One part of it is greenhouse gas emissions disclosure, and the other part of it is financial risks, so looking at those risks. And they took it a step further with respect to these requirements in that under the greenhouse gas reporting package, SB 253, they actually cite using the greenhouse gas protocol in the legislation. And that has folks somewhat worried because the greenhouse gas protocol is a very extensive standard. And for them to incorporate it by reference into the legislation means that could require very robust reporting in accordance with that. And also it includes that scope 3, and it applies to companies that not only are located in California, but that do business in California. There's a revenue threshold of $1 billion, but that's not just the revenue that you have in California, it's the revenue as a total corporation that makes companies subject. So it's bringing a lot of companies in. The climate-related risk part of it, that references the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, which is a framework for looking at those risks and opportunities associated with climate change, also referenced in that legislation. And that too applies to these companies that do business in California. So when this came out, it was, initial reaction was this is a lot far-reaching than the SEC regulation, and it is going forward. But now we're waiting for the California Air Resources Board to promulgate the regulations that go along with this legislation. So beyond that, we talk about supply chain pressure. And so earlier this year, Trinity worked with Verdantix to do an anonymous poll or study in the construction materials industry, because that's where we're seeing a lot of supply chain pressure. And they actually rank supply chain pressure and brand reputation and competitive advantage higher than regulatory pressure with respect to developing a decarbonization strategy. Also, investor pressure was ranked pretty high there. And so looking at why this is, some of it is, as I mentioned, some large corporations, and this is just an example, are making pretty aggressive commitments with respect to reducing, to meeting climate goals and meeting that Paris Agreement goal of net zero by 2050. And so here's an example. The Clorox company has laid out a very thorough, very extensive approach or strategy to reach net zero. And so their near-term strategy is focusing on their emissions, so their scope 1 and scope 2. But if you look in the upper corner here, the 93%, that's what percentage of their total footprint, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 is scope 3. Right, so most of their emissions are from their supply chain. And so that's where they're focusing on their reduction efforts in the midterm and also in the long term, basically, requiring that their suppliers reduce their emissions because that they can impact that. When you look at materiality, the two main things you look at is the size or the contribution to your overall footprint and what you can influence. And so Clorox can influence this 93% by establishing procurement requirements. And if you deal with any large corporations, we're seeing pretty stringent procurement requirements evolving for tier 1 suppliers in particular. So here's some examples. With Ford Motor Company, they asked their tier 1 suppliers to provide their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, and to establish science-based targets, reduction targets. And the predominant standard there is a science-based target initiative, and that has a pretty steep slope to reducing your emissions. And so this is a criteria for dealing, at a substantial level with Ford. Microsoft, I think, takes it even a little further because they say not only do we want you to set targets, but we're going to tell you we want it to be at least 55% reduction, absolute GHG reduction by 2030. And that's important too. So when we talk about absolute reductions, that's looking at your overall total emissions for your corporation and reducing it by a certain amount versus an intensity focused target where you're taking those total emissions and like dividing by your production. So it's an intensity focused target doesn't limit your expansion of maybe your company's operations or your market share, whereas an absolute reduction, that could be prohibitive, right? So something to think about. So that's the corporate level drivers for reducing your emissions. Looking at the product level, because of those supply chain drivers, we're seeing a lot of requests for product carbon footprint. Has any companies in here been requested to provide a product carbon footprint? We're seeing it more on the, saw a couple of hands, seeing it more on the general manufacturing side or, raw material side. And so this is one example that a client received as far as, first, do you have an environmental product declaration? And an environmental product declaration looks at all environmental impacts of a product. It's kind of like a food label. It has third-party verification. That's why that's like the first request, because it's gone through some third-party verification. And it needs to be current within the last 5 years. So that's the top request. Like, if you don't have that, have you done a life cycle assessment, which is the basis for environmental product declaration? If you don't have that, can you give us some GHG performance data? So if we can't get all of your environmental impacts, we really want that greenhouse gas component on a life cycle basis, at least cradle to gate, right? And if you don't have that, can you give us at least part of it? So that's kind of interesting, how they're facing, like, give us something that we can use in our calculation of our footprint, right? And there's also, when we talk about climate strategy, it's not all risks. There's also opportunities. So BASF is taking this product carbon footprint and using it as a marketing, ploy, because they have this on their website that basically, if you buy any chemical from BASF, you can look up their product carbon footprint. So and so that's another theme here, the drive towards transparency, right? So we've gotten calls from a lot of suppliers to BASF saying we need to give them a product carbon footprint so that they can calculate theirs and put it on their website. So another strong driver these days. And then there's also these federal initiatives. The IRA provided a lot of money to the GSA, DOT, and EPA to come up with a way to determine embodied carbon in construction materials that are being used for infrastructure projects. So what that means is they're right now trying to come up with a standardized way to measure the embodied carbon of products that are going to be used in federal infrastructure projects, right? And so it's not if any of you, has anybody ever done anything with environmental product declarations or life cycle assessment? All right, so there's a lot of work to be done here, because it is, first of all, not a lot of products have environmental product declarations in the US. There's a lot more on the European side. They're a little further ahead. But an environmental product declaration, to be used to compare two products, really, you need to make sure that that analysis is being done on a very consistent basis. So we're talking about the same boundaries, because we're talking cradle to gate. What's within that boundary? You have to specify what you're quantifying and what you're not. And then you have to have that information, some good data sets. What is that cradle to gate impact of that raw material that we use in this product? Well, that information isn't really readily available right now. But so they're trying to come up with a system to make that available, all open source. Because the other thing is, some of that information is available, but right now the life cycle assessment tools have private database that require a license to access. And so what the EPA is working on right now is making an open source data available to calculate these embodied carbon values in a consistent way based on the product that we're talking about. So that requires coming up with a standard way of defining those requirements, and that's in product category rules. And so right now they have this label program that they're working on. The first step is to improve this data quality and standardization. Once they've accomplished that, they will be setting thresholds for the construction materials that are used in infrastructure products. And so even if you're not in the construction material business. If you are a supplier to the construction material business, that could impact you as well, because these manufacturers are going to be looking to reduce their footprint so that they meet the threshold and they get those big government contracts. So here again, now it's the federal government using their purchasing power to influence the reduction in greenhouse gases. This is also already in place in a couple states. So California implemented their Buy Clean California regulation in July of 2022, where it requires that materials used in state infrastructure projects meet certain thresholds. And so that applies to mostly steel and glass and some concrete and reinforcing steel. It does not apply to cement or concrete in California. Glass and wool insulation board. And then Colorado came out with theirs last year. They added cement and they also added wood products. And so all of those suppliers now have to generate environmental product declarations to make this information available to these states if they want to sell their materials for their infrastructure projects. And then another thing that has come up recently is CBAM. So this is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU just put into place. And basically what they're doing is, the European Union has an emissions trading scheme, so a cap and trade program. And so in order to prevent leakage, in order to prevent companies that are manufacturing there from leaving the EU, they need to prevent imported products coming in with higher embodied carbon values, but lower price because they don't have that green premium from displacing those European companies. And so they've come up with this tax on imported goods. And so it applies to 6 carbon-intensive sectors, so iron and steel, cement, electricity, fertilizers, aluminum, and hydrogen. And basically, it's assessing a tax so that the cost for the manufacturers of those products will be equal to the cost to of manufacturing that product in the EU with the trading program in place. So they're trying to level the playing field. And so since this came out, there's also been a lot of talk in the US of doing the same thing, of putting some kind of carbon border adjustment on goods coming into the US, even though we don't have a cost on carbon to level set against. There have been proposals in Congress to set some kind of tax, and most of them these are just the ones that have been come out in the last year. The top one, the Prove It Act, is mostly focused on just getting a very transparent value of what the embodied carbon is on goods coming into the U.S. It doesn't set a tax. But the second one, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, is looking at energy-related products coming in and assessing a tax of $10 per ton, and then increasing that tax as time goes on. And that's mostly related to fossil fuel or any fossil fuel derived product. And then the last one actually was proposed by Republicans in Congress, and they are also looking at putting a tax on products coming into the U.S. And so I'm talking about this now in the product quantification part of the presentation, because all this is also requiring the calculation of embodied carbon of these materials. But again, they have to have a standard way. So these rules are dictating what the boundary is for those calculations are. They don't align with the environmental product declaration boundaries. They don't align with other boundaries. So it's just causing companies to have to calculate their footprint a number of different ways to meet these different drivers. Okay, so that's CBAM. And then finally, on the project level, I mentioned, the tax credits that were made available through the IRA Under Section 45, there's production tax credits. They modified the tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration and use. They made the credit amount higher and reduced the threshold for capture requirements to just incentivize more CCS projects. And they also created a tax credit for hydrogen production. There's investment tax credits for advanced energy projects under 48C that incentivizes the use of lower carbon technology in order to reduce the embodied carbon for key materials like steel and iron and aluminum. And so what that is requiring in these applications, though, is to prove that you are actually, these projects are actually resulting in a reduction. And so to do that, you have to calculate the life cycle emissions associated with the project that you're proposing to get a tax credit for versus some kind of baseline, business as usual baseline. To quantify this, the DOE is relying on guidance that was developed by the National Energy Technology Laboratory, NETL. They also provide an open source LCA model to do that called OpenLCA. They provide databases to pull in the values for this comparison. And the guidance document that they provide is very prescriptive on what that you need to include in the boundary of your project, as well as in the comparison project. And so this applies for any, for example, carbon capture and use case, because if you are claiming that you are reducing CO2 emissions by capturing that carbon and in sequestering it into some kind of use, other use, you need to prove out how much of that CO2 actually ends up sequestered in that product. And so doing this analysis is a means of demonstrating that. And that's the basis for your tax credit. It's also same with hydrogen. You have to show that the hydrogen that you're creating is clean hydrogen. So that tax credit has a threshold that you need to prove that you are over with respect to the amount of reduction in creating that hydrogen versus a baseline way of producing hydrogen, or a dirtier way of producing hydrogen. Also, there's a lot of opportunities right now. DOE's trying to give away money while they can under the IRA. And so they have the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations has these funding opportunities. If you look at those funding opportunities, there too, you need to determine and demonstrate how your project is going to reduce overall emissions, and that requires this project life cycle assessment approach. So what does all this mean, or what are we seeing? All of these companies, like bigger companies, sustainability commitments, investor demands, supplier requests is really driving this need for a comprehensive assessment of your risks and opportunities associated with the low carbon economy, and also you're having a very good understanding of your greenhouse gas footprint of your corporate operations, as well as your product, as well as maybe even any projects you may be embarking on. And they need to be very, there's a lot of push for transparency, as you're seeing with EPA, with trying to make this open source life cycle assessment and actually put labels on products. So kind of like we have in the food store, we may have that coming with a lot of products. And that for full disclosure, so companies know what they're buying. And because of these different ways of looking at it, there's a real need to slice and dice your information, your activity data that is used to calculate greenhouse gases, to come up with these different ways of looking at your footprint. And so and I borrowed this from something on social media, but it's really, if you're in an environmental department or in the sustainability department, it means there's a whole lot more data that you're having to deal with. and make sure it's accurate. And I spent all yesterday with a company saying, yeah, we've been calculating our GHG footprint, but we really aren't sure where all of the data that our plants are telling us, they have. And so it's really becoming quite of a challenge to get all of this information together. And so we're also seeing a real push to look for maybe digitizing that information. There's a lot of applications on the life cycle assessment side with respect to AI, and actually kind of have a digital twin of a product through its whole life cycle and automatically pulling that into your customer's database. And so down to providing information at the facility level or even the product lot number of what that embodied carbon footprint is. So there's a lot happening with respect to data management on developing these carbon footprints that, stay tuned. All of this is if you're in the environmental department, maybe you got a little insight of why you're being asked a lot of questions for a lot of more data than you ever had to track. When we start talking about scope 3 emissions, it's not the normal sources of information. You don't just go to the person in the plant. Now you're having to ask procurement, who are we buying this from? Where, starting to look at their footprints. So it's really kind of a data management challenge that we're all working through. So that's all I have. If we have any questions or comments, love to hear it. And it's 12 o'clock exactly. I don't know how we did that. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and grab either one of us if you have anything you want to discuss. And thank you. Have a good rest of the day.